This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I love this quote. As an ancient historian, my goals are to share the enthusiasm for and fascination with antiquity that I feel, and to show some of the connections between that world and our own. Those words are from my guest today, Professor Greg Aldrete. He is a professor of humanistic studies and history at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He earned his BA from Princeton and his master's degree and PhD in ancient history from the University of Michigan. Bottom line, Greg has studied ancient history, including a lot of warfare, a lot more than any of us. And that makes him a really fascinating guy to learn from, a terribly interesting guy to pull insights from. I'm so fortunate on this podcast to bring diversity of thinking, diversity of research, diversity of interests. All these brilliant minds, and I get to go to school and stay in school for the rest of my life. So damn awesome. Well, you get to do the same thing too, as long as you keep listening. Now, Greg has got a wide background, as I've alluded to, but today I'm going to stick in a particular territory. History's great military blunders and the lessons they teach. Greg has circled the globe to explore those pivotal incidents of catastrophic failure in battle. And he looks at how these errors changed the course of human history. It's conversations with guys like Greg where you just pause and realize humanity could have unfolded differently, if not for this battle or that one. It's a pretty damn precarious place that we humans sit at, the table that we sit at, so to speak. Because we don't have to be here. We could have screwed up. It could be entirely different today. And just like in my trading world, blunders and failure are often some of the best lessons. Again, I'm so thankful to have guests on that can take me down a path that I otherwise would not normally go. Greg Aldrete is one of those men. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I want to go back in time with you a little bit. And I would love for you to tell me the time, the moment, and I'm assuming this particular film is going to have some resonance with you, but I'm thinking of a little film in my mind with George C. Scott, and I love the scene on the battlefield with him screaming as he plays Patton, Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book. I feel like that's what I'm doing when I jump into your world. I assume Patton, the film, must have some resonance with you.
Certainly. I mean, I saw that when I was fairly young. And at the time, I was already very interested in military history. Somewhat anticipating my later career, one of the aspects or one of the scenes that film I really liked is when Patton's in North Africa and he's surveying the landscape of a battlefield. And he starts talking about a battle place there between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And he's describing it as if he had witnessed it himself. And I really like that moment of sort of replaying history from era to era, but the land stays the same and people keep fighting over this same landscape. Hopefully you can learn from those earlier battles, which is something Patton did, but all too often many generals do not learn from the past.
Well, Patton, in that particular instance, I love that story too, that scene of the film. I think he was actually hinting at reincarnation, that he was actually there as a part of the battle, right?
Yeah, he seemed to have some beliefs that he had been reincarnated a number of times and had indeed fought in many battles in many eras.
Today, I want to take you down a path of talking about a lot of particular, or as many as we can cover in our time today, particular military blunders. I'm going to let you explain in a second why a blunder is not necessarily a bad thing for us to look at. But maybe take me back some in terms of your diving into these subject areas? Because I read something really interesting about, I guess you went to the Vatican as one part of your research. I'm sure you've been everywhere. But there's something to be said that when you get behind the scenes and you're looking at documentation that's 1,000+ years old, it's a lot different than just seeing some particular article on Wikipedia. I mean, it really changes you physically, mentally, spiritually. I mean, when you see a document that's getting right to a particular battle or something you're investigating and you're looking at documentation at the Vatican, maybe 1,500, 2,000 years old, that's just an amazing feeling, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, there's a power to physical objects that just reading words on a page doesn't have. The thing that I think of in connection with this is in my classes when I teach, I always make a point of bringing in actual ancient coins, ancient Greek and Roman coins, and putting them in the students' hands and saying, you're now holding a man-made object that is 2,500 years old. And you can just see on their faces that kind of thought that, what I'm holding in my hand has been held by hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Think of all the different things that they've bought with it over the centuries. The fact that they're holding it represents a tragedy because it means somebody lost it at some point and it was preserved for us to find today. Just having that even briefest kind of physical contact with an artifact from the past and with these previous civilizations, I think makes them come alive in a way that no amount of reading a textbook really can.
It probably also drops our personal arrogance a little bit, and you instantly are reminded that we're not so special. A lot of people came before us, and we're just a continuum that will go forward, and people will be looking back thousands of years back at us with the same kind of feeling.
Well, it's certainly a historical truism that people are not any smarter today than they were thousands of years ago. Our technology has changed, but we shouldn't mistake that for intelligence, and particularly emotions. I mean, people respond in the same way emotionally. And another thing I always tell my students is when you do study the ancient world or study an ancient text, the two things you should look for are moments when you're reading that text and you have the kind of reaction you say, I know exactly how this person felt. And conversely, the other thing you should look for is moments when you think, I can't imagine how this person could possibly have done this. And if you can sort of start to build up a mosaic of those moments of empathy and moments of total lack of understanding, that's the key to beginning to understand a different culture, whether it's one in the past or even today. So it's kind of finding those moments of similarity and difference and then building up from that.
Also, too, when you say, gosh, people 2,000 years ago were no less smart than people today, that's not something that in the human condition, in current modern world, it's a thought that you don't ever hear expressed, right? We talk about everything else in popular culture and media, but we don't talk about something so basic, so common sense, so daunting, frankly, that to think like, my gosh, we just, again, not so special. And that the things, in many ways, the men and women were putting thoughts together a couple thousand years ago were probably blowing us away in terms of their intelligence.
You really can't understand yourself today if you don't understand where you came from. And the past is what creates us. The motto of the Delphic Oracle was know yourself. The first thing I always say to people who say, why should I study ancient history, or what relevance does ancient history have to me today, is I say, well, you can't understand anything about yourself today unless you understand where we came from. Everything, our calendar, our laws, our architecture, our religion, our rituals, our habits, our superstitions, all of these have direct roots in the ancient world. So whether you know it or not, you're constantly walking in the footsteps of the ancients, and they're not just influencing you, but really determining almost every aspect of your daily life.
Let's jump into a little bit of the big picture of where I really want to go today, which is talking about some well-known military blunders. Some of these blunders people might instantly recognize in your work. Some of them people might have to really jog their memory. Some maybe they've never heard of, but they're all quite amazing events. And I think the thing that we forget about sometimes in a conflict is there's a winner, there's a loser that can change the course of everything. Inside of that is often the decision-making where if one didn't take a certain step, they possibly could have avoided the entire conflict, the entire war, the entire changing of humanity if they just did not act and did not take a step. When you start to think about that, If you had to play the dice roll over again, right? If humanity was played over for the last 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 years, a few key events and everything's different. A few key events unfolding differently. Everything's different today.
Sure. I mean, this is the classic butterfly effect, that you change one tiny thing at a far enough distance in the past, and everything that subsequently follows is completely changed. And there's truth to that. I mean, history is not this inevitable sequence of events. It's not simply one thing after another. It's an ever-branching set of pathways. The further back in time you go along those pathways, the more branches stem out from them. Little tiny things can affect later history. And one of the fascinating aspects of history in general, and military history in particular, because it's so focused, is to think, what if on this particular day this general hadn't, had a stomach flu? Would he have made a better decision? And all of history is different. Or what if the message had gotten to someone 30 seconds later? And it's easy to start sort of picking out these moments and say, well, this changed the entire course of history.
So you've got a scenario you lay out for a true military defeat to qualify as a blunder. 4 things have to take place. So why don't you kind of clarify what you might mean by blunder and then give the audience the feeling for those 4 aspects?
When I had to conceptualize this notion of studying military blunders across history, the first thing I had to do, of course, is define what I meant by a blunder. The key element or key characteristic that I think I pinned everything on was, to be a true blunder, it had to be avoidable. The outcome of a battle or a conflict had to be in doubt. It can't just be a situation where one side is outnumbered or there was a random misfortune. A mistake had to be made. If you can identify a mistake, you can also start to assign blame. So for me, blunder had this concept of something, it could have turned out a different way. Maybe it should have turned out a different way, but somewhere along the line, somebody made a decision, something happened that caused this to go wrong. I further kind of categorized the types of blunders into sort of 4 broad areas, what I call failures of planning, failures of leadership, failures of execution, and failures of adaptation. That means dealing with change, basically. By sort of having this typology, I could start to analyze different battles and say, well, here they're making these kinds of errors. And once you build a kind of typology like that, you see that, well, they just repeat over and over again, that lots and lots of people have failures of leadership. And you can start looking at different kinds of things, people who are just simply incompetent, or people who are good at one thing maybe aren't good at something else. Overconfidence is a whole fascinating area. I mean, this is one of the most common failures of leadership. What's interesting about overconfidence is you'll see examples of, quite frankly, bad generals being overconfident. For example, when the British go into Africa and fight the Zulus, the British commander Chelmsford has kind of a typical colonial era disdain for what he sees as savages and primitives who have unsophisticated technology. So he simply doesn't take them seriously. He doesn't fortify his camp. He doesn't scout properly, and he gets wiped out. But also sometimes you have generals who are decent or even sometimes good generals can also be overconfident. So here you might think of Custer, Little Bighorn, where, again, he was just convinced that if we show up, the Native Americans will sort of flee and will win the battle. So he had been a good commander in some contexts, but in this context, he was completely overconfident. And then you get truly great generals who can fall prey to the same thing. For example, Napoleon, who is often acknowledged as one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, his invasion of Russia was just saturated with incidences of his overconfidence.
Let me get you to pause right there on Napoleon, because that was really the first blunder that I really wanted to let you go into on a deep dive. I'm looking at your text right now, and I love the date, June 23rd, 1812. Napoleon enters Russia with 500,000 men. That's a huge force, 1812. I mean, he's at the peak of his power, but he didn't have to do that. He did not have to do that. And if he did not do that, boy, that just starts to open up the whole chain of events of what could have happened in terms of history. But why don't you take a deeper dive on Napoleon and his blunder of going into Russia? And really, for the audience that perhaps either has forgot some of the details or never knew, give your perspective on it.
Napoleon in 1812 was pretty much at the height of his power. He had solidified most of Europe under his control. Britain really seemed to be on the ropes. He was doing quite well. He had a huge army. I mean, just gigantic by the time, at least more than 500,000 men. They were experienced. They were hardened veterans. He had a huge artillery train with him. He had a very well-trained cavalry. And he had to decide what he wanted to do next. He decides that he's going to invade Russia. Russia was his remaining main continental foe. To do this, his plan was to kind of strike into Russia, seize Moscow, and then he assumed that by capturing the capital, that would lead to the collapse of the government and the surrender of the country. And this was a strategy he had used in other places. So typically when you invade a country, if you capture the capital city, you win the war. He goes into Russia with this huge army of 500,000 men, full of confidence, and like many people both before and after him, somewhat underestimates the scale of this endeavor. I mean, if you're used to fighting in Europe where countries aren't that far apart, all of a sudden you go into Russia and distances start to be measured in hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles. The Russians have a kind of time-honored strategy, which is just to give ground. They can even suffer huge defeats. But the two things that Russia, historically speaking, has always had is a large population, so they can absorb a lot of losses, and it's just a big country. So you can allow invaders to keep coming in. Napoleon marches into Russia. Things seem to be going well. He fights some battles. The most important of these was the Battle of Borodino, which was just a bloodbath. The French lost about 30,000 men, the Russians 45,000. This is just nightmarish kind of levels of slaughter, really human tragedy. But even though Napoleon wins that, it's a kind of Pyrrhic victory. It doesn't lead to final victory. So the Russians just retreat further, go back. Napoleon keeps chasing them. Finally, he does achieve his aim. He captures Moscow, so he gets there. But by this point, his men are exhausted. Most importantly, by this point, the seasons have started to change. We're getting into winter, and the Russian winters are legendary for being cold, for being inhospitable. And Napoleon's men are tired out. They're not really equipped to withstand the winter. When the Russians leave Moscow, they yield it to Napoleon. They burn down much of the city, so they can't even take shelter there. Napoleon at this point has a choice. He, at that point, still could have turned around, pulled his army out, gotten most of them home, and still been in decent shape. But here's where I think his pride or his hubris comes into play, where he's used to victory, he's used to his strategies working, and he just can't let go of this notion that if I just hang around, if I just occupy the capital, that it'll result in victory. Uncharacteristically for Napoleon, he hesitates, he dithers, he wastes some time in Moscow and the surrounding areas, and finally he comes to the realization, yes, I've just got to pull back, it's not working, but by that point, winter's set in. The retreat from Moscow becomes this terrible nightmare where his men are slogging back through snow, there's Cossacks sort of raiding and attacking them, they're eating their horses, they're eating their boots, they're out of food, people are freezing to death on sentry duty, just all kinds of just truly horrific kinds of deprivation and hardship. His entire army dies.
Literally, we're talking like 90% plus, right?
Yes. I mean, he goes in with 500,000 men, he comes out with about 10,000 effectives. So it's just a complete disaster. And he loses things that are irreplaceable. He loses his veterans, who had been the ones who had won many battles for him. He loses all his horses. I mean, all the horses die or are eaten. And in later battles, Napoleon is crippled by the lack of cavalry who perform essential scouting functions. So even though Napoleon raises some more armies of men, he can never replace those lost cavalry contingents. The invasion of Russia just turns into this utter disaster, and he truly loses his entire army. And a lot of it is overconfidence. A lot of it is his pride. And so this is why it is a classic blunder. Here's an example of even the best generals being led astray by their egos. It's a nice kind of lesson in that. And it does change the course of history because Napoleon then is fighting from a much, much weaker position. So the Napoleonic Wars will go on for some time. Eventually, he'll be defeated at Waterloo and other battles at Leipzig. But the turning point, if you will, is the invasion of Russia, because it leaves him in such a weaker position that he can never quite recover from that.
For us out there that are thinking, listening to you map that out, walk us through that narrative, I'm asking you a hypothetical, but let's imagine that Napoleon did not invade Russia. What was the landscape at that moment in time? There was not a need to invade Russia. It was more of a conquest and kind of eliminate a potential foe, but he could have just solidified his control of Europe at the time and not done that, correct?
Yes, and this is one of the great fun things of history is counterfactuals, the what-if questions. So what if Napoleon had made a different decision? What would have happened? You can look at some short-term effects. There's really no way to predict the long ones because it just becomes a new world. I mean, if you had Napoleon with all of his talent, with all of his skills, with that 500,000-man army at his disposal, certainly he could have dominated Europe. He could have crushed any sort of opposition to him. A lot of the countries and coalitions of Europe were, even at that point, they were allies of Napoleon, but they were sort of half-hearted allies, the Austrians and the Prussians. He could have really consolidated his control there. Now, the two remaining enemies he had were Great Britain and Russia, and both of them in some ways were untouchable. Unless Napoleon could get across the English Channel and invade Britain, he could not really get to Great Britain. England's great asset was their navy. They were able to stop Napoleon from crossing the English Channel. And Russia, in a way, was also protected by a natural feature, just that huge geography and the problems of getting into Russia and dealing with the winter. So in some ways, he was geographically constrained. Yes, he could have conquered Europe and maybe consolidated his hold there, but I'm not sure it was really within his power to effectively reach those two remaining key enemies.
You mentioned something earlier, too, in terms of another blunder, and we can jump right into it because I think it dovetails with some similar bad decision-making. And that's the whole premise here. The premise is we can learn from these blunders because we can find the commonality in their decision-making that was faulty. General Custer, lay it out. Lay out the scenario of what was going on there. Because obviously, when you're a kid in America, at least, you grow up hearing about that story all the time. Probably never get to the level of detail, though, that you have put together.
Custer and the Battle of Little Big Horn, or as it's sometimes called the Battle of Greasy Grass, is an interesting one because Custer was just this extremely flamboyant character. This is a personality-driven incident.
A young guy, like 25 years old, right? He became a general at 25, so he became a general really early.
Yes. He was kind of a boy wonder of the army. So he had done very well. He had gained a lot of notoriety. And in modern terms, he was just good at self-promotion. He was someone who was very, very good at ingratiating himself with his superiors and in sort of cutting a memorable figure. He was no doubt brave. I mean, he had that in terms of his positive qualities. He was a gifted cavalry commander. He was good at commanding mounted troops, and he was ambitious. So he did become the youngest general in the entire army when he was in his mid-20s. On the other hand, to go along with that ambition and that sort of fearlessness, he was rash. He was excessively prone to taking risks, and he was egotistical. He liked to promote himself. He wore a kind of outlandish outfit that he sort of made up himself. He had this jacket with big gold decoration on it. He always wore a bright red tie. He had his trademark sort of long blonde hair arranged in these little curly locks. He liked to cut a dashing figure. That was his self-image. And his fellow officers didn't necessarily like this. I mean, he rubbed people the wrong way very definitely. And when we come to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, what sort of precipitated this whole thing was the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. This was territory that by various treaties, which themselves were a little legally and ethically dubious, had at least ceded certain territories to the Native Americans. But then when they discovered gold there, sorry, we want those too. So they were pushing into these areas, and the army had instituted a policy saying that a lot of the Native Americans had to, in essence, sort of give themselves up and report to different reservations. Not surprisingly, many of them resisted after having so many treaties broken. They didn't trust the U.S. government anymore. Custer and a number of other cavalry contingents were sent into this region to sort of round up what they would have referred to at the time as the hostiles, referring to the indigenous people. His force wasn't very big. It was relatively small, just a couple hundred men really under Custer's direct command, whereas the Native Americans, particularly under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who were both leaders, Crazy Horse more of a military leader, Sitting Bull more of a kind of spiritual leader, had gathered together thousands of Native Americans who were all determined to sort of make a stand and to oppose things. And Custer has some vague notion where they are, but not really exactly.
Greg, can you outline how those particular groups were armed? What were Custer's guys armed with, and what were the Native Americans armed with?
Custer's men were standard sort of U.S. cavalry of the mid-19th century. They would have had carbines, which are sort of rifles that you can reload fairly quickly. Some of them would have had pistols. Some of them would have augmented their official kind of government issue weapons with other firearms. So they're basically guns, many of them repeating guns that they could fire fairly rapidly. The Native Americans are a more mixed bag. I mean, you would have everything there from some of them being armed with contemporary firearms to some of them having older, almost kind of musket-like things, some of them still using lances and arrows. When archaeologists have excavated the battlefield of Little Bighorn, one of the interesting things is just they found an amazing, diverse array of ammunition, indicating that people on both sides were just shooting with all kinds of different weapons, different caliber guns, different levels of technology. So you really have all kinds of things mixing together there.
Would the Native American weapons, except for the stuff that they had developed, would those weapons they had been acquired through victories or whatnot? I mean, obviously, they were not developing these weapons themselves.
A lot of them had been acquired in trades with various settlers or white people or merchants. Some of them had been stolen or taken off, acquired in victories. So if they had, killed some other cavalry contingent, they would certainly scavenge the weapons. So that's how it became such a mishmash of things. It's just all kinds of different stuff. And the key element here is the planning. So one of the things I talk about is failures of planning. And one of the problems it's rarely a good idea in warfare is to divide your command too much. This is what Custer does. He splits his force up into a number of groups. So it's already a very tiny force, severely outnumbered, thousands versus hundreds, but then he further subdivides them. There's also some personality conflicts with some of his officers, and some of them just seem not that competent. I mean, there's a lot of this is one of these battles that all the survivors or relatives of the survivors and people who knew them have all written contesting accounts of who's to blame. So there's lots of accusations that so-and-so was an alcoholic or was a coward. And it's sometimes hard to sift through the truth of all this because it is such a famous moment. But what is indisputable is that Custer makes a bad error in splitting up his already small forces, sending them out without a real clear plan of what they're supposed to do. It was just kind of a vague notion that we'll have a right wing, a left wing, and a center, and the two wings will sort of envelop the enemy and we'll just surround them.
What would the expectation have been for an American military general like Custer in terms of their armaments, their technology versus the opposition? Meaning he's got such a small force, just tiny compared to thousands. For his limited number of guys, obviously he must be thinking, we've got a couple hundred guys, we're good to go against thousands. So there was that belief that their force, their armaments, their guns, one of their guys was as good as how many of the other guys. That was part of the calculation?
Yes. And in this case, I think it's not even so much reliance on technology as just almost a kind of moral superiority. I mean, quite frankly, it's almost a racist notion that, the Native Americans are intrinsically sort of cowardly. If we make a show of force, they'll run away. So that's driving this one in the same way that it drove a lot of the disasters that happened to the British colonial army in, let's say, Afghanistan or India or Africa. I mean, almost all of these were instances where there's more of a technology differential. So sometimes the British really did have high tech versus people armed with spears. But just as bad as that overconfidence was just underestimating the enemy, believing that they will simply flee when they see us, that they won't display qualities of initiative or bravery or cleverness in battle. This is some of what Custer's doing too, is that he's just assuming just the sight of us will literally make them run away or surrender. I mean, that's almost what he's thinking here.
When it's life or death, that's such a cocky thought to have, huh?
He's a cocky guy. I mean, this is Custer's whole personality, and others with him looked at him and said, "You're crazy. This is just stupid." But he was supremely overconfident, and that's how he had made his career. It was by being self-promoting, by being aggressive always. And it works. I mean, people who are aggressive often succeed, but at some point that might bite you. And this is the moment where it bites Custer. So that's exactly what's going on here. I mean, he divides his forces. They make contact with the encampment. It turns out to be way bigger than they thought. Thousands of braves, thousands of warriors. They at first do sort of go in and attack quite boldly. The first group of about 120 guys who encounter them and very quickly realize they're terribly outmatched, and they start retreating. They try to link up with another of the three sort of wings. They do eventually get together. By this point, the Native Americans, particularly under Crazy Horse, are reacting, are starting to come out, starting to snipe at them. And then the whole thing just turns into this kind of nightmarish series of little skirmishes over the terrain. I've been to the Custer battlefield, and it's one of the most evocative battlefields I've visited. I've visited a lot of battlefields. And the reason why is that at the Little Bighorn, they put the grave markers on the sites where the soldiers actually died. You can trace the course of the battle by seeing this line of tombstones kind of scattered, let's say, going up a hillside. And you can exactly see, well, this is where Reno's men, that's one of Custer's sub-commanders, was retreating up the hillside. Men were being picked off one by one. And those gravestones are right there, kind of scattered across that hillside as they go up there. And they are one by one sort of die. And then at the end, you'll come to a cluster of maybe a couple dozen closely grouped together where they made a final stand. And so it's very easy to visualize the battle, because each site where one of the cavalrymen died is actually indicated by this tombstone. So it's very different from other battlefields, which just tend to be a big grassy open plain, and then somewhere to the side maybe there's a cemetery with hundreds or thousands of graves all arranged in nice rows. In this one, the battle is right there in front of your eyes, and you can easily visualize the fear and the terror. You can see a cluster of graves sort of heading up for a piece of high ground where the men were trying to retreat to, where they thought, well, maybe we can hold out here and make kind of a last stand. It's a very interesting battlefield to visit in person, and really a bit different from other battlefields. And I think the best way to just sort of see how the battle unfolded, because this isn't a battle with a lot of clear maneuvering and lines, it's chaos. It's a bunch of individual skirmishes. It's a bunch of guys just running for their lives or trying to find a place to make a stand. And that's captured in the way that the battlefield looks today. Basically, that's what happens. I mean, one by one, these little groups are cut off, surrounded, massacred, or they try to run and they're picked off one by one. And in the end, all of them are slain. And it's a huge victory for the Native Americans. I mean, they completely not just sort of fooled Custer into underestimating them, but then they handled the encounter well. They sent groups to cut off some of the Custer's men from retreating. They surrounded them in a very kind of intelligent, planned way. So it's both Custer's overconfidence, which leads him to make a lot of errors, and good generalship on the part of Crazy Horse and some of the Native Americans.
What I like about your work and how you've put these stories together is there's a certain objective nature to it, to where you're not trying to say, oh, I'm an American and I side with Custer. You're not trying to get into that. You're really at the strategy of what was going on. I think back, trying to jog my memory from my childhood, I recall the story of Custer was more of a us Americans got burned, or, it was never really an objective look at saying, my gosh, the strategy by the Native Americans was quite strong. It was always something very different growing up, meaning you just kind of had to defend the American position. Whereas what you're doing in your work is you're saying, hey, let's look at this objectively and not try and be tribal about it.
With this sort of history, I am trying to take an objective perspective and put my own biases or, sort of allegiances to the side. One of the things that some people actually, when I've talked to people who have viewed my courses or watched it, they've actually raised as criticism is they said, well, you're really harsh on Britain. You must hate Britain because so many of the examples are examples of blunders by Britain. And that was an interesting moment for me because as a child, I grew up reading a lot of both historical narratives and historical fiction where the British were the heroes. One of the really influential book series on me was the Horatio Hornblower books about this 18th century naval commander during the Napoleonic Wars, who was a real hero. So, I idolized when I was 10 years old Horatio Hornblower and loved this sort of, British naval professionalism and all this. So in some ways, I'm very sympathetic or had that. But yet what's fascinating sometimes is to look at those moments when people who are usually very competent or very good screw up, because there is sometimes a lot more to be learned from failure than success. So by looking at militaries who ordinarily are very good, very competent, very successful, and seeing the moments when they make these errors, sometimes those are a lot more enlightening than just a incompetent, poorly led, poorly organized, technologically inferior force losing. You're not going to learn as much from that. And I have, for example, another battle, which is the Battle of Carrhae, which is a Roman one. I mean, the Romans are the guys I study. They're the ones I sort of most empathize with. The Roman legions are famous as being one of the great kind of efficient, frightening, well-organized, well-disciplined armies in all of history. But yet, that's why it's so interesting to look at this example where they failed utterly and were wiped out by an inferior force.
By the way, as you go back in time a little bit, I'm curious your take. I think I've watched the movie all the way through, but it got me bored after a little bit. But what'd you think of the 300?
300 is an interesting movie in that it gets a lot of the details sort of wrong, and it gets some of them just egregiously wrong. I mean, there aren't strange mutant people in the Persian army, and the king isn't 11 feet tall with weird body piercings. I mean, so there's all these very just strange things in it, but some of it is actually accurate and even more accurate than some of the previous films made about the same thing. I mean, there was an earlier film made in the 50s or the 60s about this, that the 300 actually gets some of the stuff right. So they actually include a number of direct quotes in the dialogue of the movie from ancient authors like Herodotus, who writes about these wars. It's interesting to see these little snippets popping up in there. Their depiction of the Spartan kind of school system, the agoge that they put students through, where they have to endure hardship and they're always fighting one another and they have to go live in the wilderness and fight wolves and stuff like this, that's true. That actually happened. Now, there's a lot of stuff that are just completely sort of skewed. There's some big differences, but it's an interesting mix. I mean, kind of the same thing with Gladiator, which is the movie which revived the Hollywood sword and sandal epic. Before Gladiator, there was this gap of about 40 years when nobody had made a big budget film in the ancient world. Gladiator is the same kind of mix of some very accurate stuff and some completely invented fictitious stuff, and then some things which are really Hollywood versions of ancient Rome. I tend to try not to be overly critical of historical movies because any film often gets people interested in ancient history. And to me, that's a good thing. So yes, the film may not be the most accurate, but simply pedantically pointing out all the little errors seems beside the point. What you want to do is to say, well, yes, this is an interesting movie. It's a good narrative. Now maybe go find out about some of the reality. There are these entryways that get people interested in ancient history, and so I think that's a good thing.
Let me bring you to a particular, I think we could call it a blunder. I don't know that if you've written about it, so if you don't want to go there, I would understand. I think it'd be very instructive, especially if you've done some thinking about it. But it sure looks like to me, and I've spent some time in this particular country, it sure looks like to me that in hindsight, there's absolutely nothing we can call about the Vietnam War except a blunder.
Vietnam is one of these wars. Well, start with when I put together my sort of list of military blunders, I cut it off around World War II because as an ancient historian, I take a very long view of history. And for me, everything since then is sort of modern, recent, contemporary history. And sometimes you really don't fully understand events till you have a little bit of perspective, a little bit of distance. And so Vietnam from my mind, is still a relatively recent war. And so it's an obvious one to address, but I didn't because I don't think there's yet that full historical perspective. But it certainly exemplifies some of the ideas. I mean, one of the concepts is failures of planning. And the first failure of planning that I talk about in the lecture series is wars that were just a bad idea in the first place, where the risks are not worth the rewards. This is something that countries fall into over and over again, where they get into a war basically for the wrong reasons. And Vietnam is sort of an example of that, where it's the objectives were clear, but they weren't very well thought out, and they weren't very well matched to what was actually happening. Also, it's an example of wars where you just have certain preconceived notions of how to fight, and you don't adapt to the local situation or the local terrain particularly. So it's a kind of jungle guerrilla war, and the U.S. had ideas, well, we can go in, we have bombers, we have tanks, but those don't really help you in the jungle. This is a classic error that you see over and over and over again. One of the lectures I talk about is one that takes place in the early sort of Middle Ages, the Battle of Courtrai, where you have a bunch of knights in full plate armor on giant war horses who charge across a muddy field. Well, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to get stuck, right? They're going to get bogged down. That's a case where having high technology doesn't help you at all. If you're stuck in the mud and can't move, some shopkeeper with a wooden club can come up and beat you to death, which is exactly what happens at that battle. So it's a famous example of, knights being overcome by shopkeepers. So technology doesn't always give you the edge. You have to adapt it to the local situation, to the local terrain, and that's something you see in Vietnam as well.
I want to go back in time a little bit to something that I brought up at the beginning of this conversation. I brought up the notion of some of your research, you being in the Vatican, going through documents, artifacts. Is there a particular artifact for you that really just resonates as something that when you held it in your hands, you just said, wow? And I want to share something with you really quick. Years ago, I was doing some research on price histories of markets, and I got access to the stacks. And I believe it's the U.S. National Agricultural Research Library around the Beltway outside D.C. I got access to the stacks. It was really fascinating to just look over. And there's no one else up in those stacks. I see a newspaper just laying there. And it was the newspaper the day after Lincoln was shot. This was 20 years ago. I've never forgot that. It was the most amazing thing to just look over. Like, wow. For you, though, you've taken research to a whole different level. I would love to go play around the bowels of the Vatican libraries. But is there any particular artifact for you that you just really kind of looked at or that you just saw that was just so memorable for you, and why?
I'll give you two, one sort of humorous and one more serious. The humorous one was, as an undergraduate, you take a lot of courses and you study famous artworks and, you hear about these great things. And then they sort of take on this mythic quality at that age. There's this one very famous statue of Diocletian and the other 4 Roman emperors who ruled at the time, the Tetrarchs. So it's this sort of purple marble statue. It's really famous. You take an art history course, you see it. The first time I took a big trip around Europe was the summer after graduating from college. I did the usual backpack around with my roommates for 3 months. And we were in Venice. We were tired. It's 100 degrees. It's August. I'm sitting on the side of St. Mark's Cathedral, which is the big cathedral in Venice, drinking a Coke. And I sort of look at what I'm leaning against, and I realize it's the statue of the Tetrarchs. And it had just been glued or cemented into the corner, very anonymous, kind of inconspicuous corner of this cathedral. And here it's one of these amazing artworks. That's the moment when a couple things sort of hit me. One is that Europe just has a different relationship to the past. I mean, in the US, nothing is older than 250 years about. Things tend to be treated just with much more kind of reverence. In Italy, the past is all around you. It's still alive. You're living in these cities that go back 2,000 years, and there's just layer upon layer upon layer built up. For them, they still live in and among these artifacts. Here's a statue that, if it were in the United States, it would be behind plate glass. It would be in a museum. It would be this kind of hushed atmosphere. There would be dim lighting shining on it. It would be this kind of reverence towards an object, almost this worship of this sacred object. And in Italy, here's this incredibly famous statue just stuck on the side of the building with pigeons crapping on it and tourists, drinking Cokes. And it was just a neat moment. that, yes, I'm touching this piece of history, which I've studied, which is incredibly important, but also it shows the relationship different groups have to history itself. And the second moment, the sort of more serious one, was when I, again, was pretty young. I was a grad student. I was working on my dissertation. And I took a trip to Europe to do research, and I managed to finagle permission to get into the Vatican Library, which sometimes is hard to do, but I had some connections through my professors, and got to examine this, again, famous manuscript of the plays of the Roman author Terence. And there's this one particular version of this manuscript, which is about 1,200 years old, that has these wonderful illustrations, so painted, all kinds of things. And after going through all these steps, finally the librarians just come out and kind of slap into my hands this book, this precious manuscript, and just walk off. And so there I am holding this thing, worth, I don't know, $1 million or something in my hand that's over 1,000 years old. It's beautiful. It's an illuminated manuscript. It's just magnificent. That's one of these moments that for me was just really meaningful as a historian, to be able to touch these documents, to read them, to see firsthand something that some monk, in the Middle Ages had inscribed, which was itself preserving knowledge from 1,500 years earlier than himself. That's one of these great moments that, as a historian, it's really fun to be able to handle the raw data, so to speak, of history, this original document, and do my own little research on it for the project that I was working on.
Let me go back to where we were leading off from Napoleon, and eventually in the decades that follow, the rise of Germany, and coming into the 20th century, the rise of Hitler. I mean, I would assume that to some degree, if Hitler would have not been so desirous to just expand and expand and expand, he could have expanded a little and held control for a much longer time. The counterfactual again. Is there any particular event with Hitler where you would get us to go back and think about, if he did not do that, we still might have residuals, or the Nazis would still exist today?
For me, the turning point with the war against Hitler is a replay of the Napoleon thing. It's his invasion of Russia. Both men were in similar situations where they had established dominance over the European continent, had conquered most of their foes there. Their two remaining foes were Great Britain, which was protected by its navy, and Russia. And in both cases, Napoleon and Hitler, they both make the decision to invade Russia, and it goes completely wrong for both of them, and they end up destroying basically their own armies and leaving them crippled and weakened. For me, the invasion of Russia, which at the time, Hitler was actually an ally of Russia. He wasn't an enemy of Russia. He was their ally, and he turned against them and invaded them. So it was even more kind of unnecessary from that perspective. That was just his fatal error. And I mean, if you want to pick the one battle, it is Stalingrad. If you look at Stalingrad, that's where a whole German army was wiped out. It showed the Germans could be beaten. The Russians sort of turned the Germans' own blitzkrieg and encirclement tactics against them. And if you look at the statistics from World War II, everybody likes to talk about D-Day as the turning point. And it was very important, I mean, for all sorts of reasons. But if you look at where most of the German army died, something like 70 or 80% of the casualties take place on the Eastern Front. That's where Hitler was defeated. D-Day was enormously important, not so much for defeating Hitler, because Hitler had already been beaten by Russia. But what D-Day did is it prevented the Russians from seizing all of Europe. So it was a crucial turning point, but less so for World War II than for subsequent history, in preventing all of Europe from just falling under the control of Stalin, which would have been an enormous disaster.
I would think one of the biggest blunders, too, and I've only just kind of as an outside weekend warrior looking at this, but all Hitler had to do was essentially kind of stall for probably less than half a decade, and he would have had nukes. And then everything changes.
Germans in World War II invented a lot of technologies that seem almost science fiction-y ahead of their time. So, they had jets, and they were working on nuclear weapons and all sorts of the wonder weapon myth. And it is a little bit of a myth. I mean, just inventing these things doesn't mean that you can use them effectively or that they'll play out the way you think. But there was a lot of creativity there. I mean, war spurs innovation. It's a sad truth. I mean, if you look at aviation, in World War II, the war began with planes made of plywood and fabric and held together with little wires. 4 years later, you have jet fighters. That's this concentrated technological evolution that occurs because of warfare, and that often happens with wars. What would have happened if Hitler had not invaded Russia, had just held on to the continent? It's hard to say. The other thing that really defeats Hitler is the United States, bringing the industrial might of the United States to bear against Hitler. Because then you just overwhelm him with sheer sort of just masses of manpower and goods and tanks and everything else. Another of Hitler's sort of fatal errors, if you like, was allowing the U.S. to get sucked into the war by exacerbating that process by submarine warfare and things like that.
Right, because if he did not suck the U.S. in, and that to some degree is his decision-making, then he could have consolidated, held on, and to try and think how history might have unfolded differently. We might still have a Nazi state somewhere in Europe.
Yeah, it's sort of frightening to contemplate, but you could see it. On the other hand, Hitler did seem to be on a bit of a self-destructive path. He was kind of unbalanced, and by the end of his life, just not seeing reality as it was. So he may have imploded, so to speak, on his own, even if he had achieved complete control over Europe.
I got to tell you, your direction, your path, the research you've put together in a day and age where so many people are focused on absolute nonsense, it is really refreshing and energizing, stimulating, intellectually stimulating to dive into the history and to see what we can learn and pull out and think about for us today. Because look, there are a lot of people who have come before us, very bright people. They've made good decisions and bad decisions. And there are things that we can take away from that. And there's not much we can take away from the daily grind of talking heads, talking politics on the cable news stations. That stuff's pretty much useless. But your world, there's something really there.
Well, we were just talking about technology, and I was thinking about lessons that one can draw from military blunders in regard to technology. And the one that people often point to is people tend to fight wars with the weapons of the last war. So you get all the examples of the Civil War, World War I, where you have people charging into machine gun fire in trenches and just dying. And that's pretty straightforward. But a more interesting twist, in my mind, is one of the battles I talk about, which is the Battle of Nagashino, which is a samurai battle that took place in sort of feudal Japan. This was at a moment in Japanese history where gunpowder had arrived, but it wasn't very common yet. Both sides at the Battle of Nagashino had access to very crude kind of firearms, almost like muskets.
Put a year on that one, Greg.
Nagashino, I think, was 1575. So that's when this takes place. It's part of the wars about who will be shogun and who controls things. It's a lot of the famous families, Takeda Shingen and the Tokugawa family, but none of that really matters to the technology aspect. But so you have these two samurai armies. Both of them have access to guns. Both of them have them in their army. So this is the new technology, and both have said, we're going to start using it. But one side completely slaughters the other at the battle. The reason they do so is because it's not just they have the technology. Both sides have it, but they're the ones who figure out how to use it. So it's not enough just to stick a piece of high tech in someone's hands. You also have to understand how to use it. So, for example, one side takes their men armed with these sort of primitive firearms and just scatters them throughout their army. They just see them as other soldiers, just like guys with swords or spears or arrows. We'll just kind of disperse them throughout. But the other side realizes that the way that gunpowder weapons are effective in this era, because they're not very accurate, is you mass them together. So you have big blocks of guys all shooting in the same direction at the same moment, and you create this kind of hail of bullets that doesn't matter if the individual gun's inaccurate, you'll hit your broader target. The same side figures out, they're very vulnerable because it takes a long time to reload these guns, so we're going to position these blocks of guys behind defenses, behind sort of, big trees and things like this, so that when the enemy sends their cavalry against them, they can't get through and just slaughter them all while they're reloading. The other side also figures out things like, since it takes so long to reload, maybe we'll organize them into 3 ranks, 3 rows, and we'll have one row shoot while the other 2 are reloading, and then they'll kind of swap places. So you maintain this constant stream of fire. The net result at Nagashino was one side was completely wiped out. It was a crushing victory. Both sides had the same technology, but one just understood how to use it. And that's one of those things that I think is a lesson for us today, that constantly talk about technology and have to adapt to new change and new technology. But it's not just having it, it's really understanding its potential and knowing how to use it.
Well, yeah, my gosh, everyone's got a laptop and an iPhone, but some people know how to use those tools in ways that make themselves vast fortunes and other people just use them to make phone calls. History's great military blunders and the lessons they teach. Greg, very cool stuff. I'm very happy to meet you, very happy to hear your stories, your narratives, fascinating career direction. I really love it. I appreciate you coming on today and taking some time. Is there a place that we can send people beyond Amazon and the great courses? Is there somewhere where you would like my audience to go to check more out about you?
I have a website, so you can see what I'm doing, what my projects are if they do that. So just search my name and it'll come up online, and you can see the various publications I've done. I do a lot of these teaching company courses, which are aimed at the general public, because I believe that one of the aspects of my job as a professional historian is to try to reach out to the average person and to say, hey, history is interesting and it's relevant to your life, and here's why. Yes, I write scholarly books, and I have a number of those, but I also try to intersperse those with projects that just try to tell history as a story and try to connect it to our lives. Check out my website. You can see some of those.
And plus, almost all guys like war stories. It makes you going back to when you were a kid. And that was the most fun thing about learning, I remember as a kid, I'd be drawing weapons, going through World War I and World War II and learning how to draw these particular long firearms or tanks or whatnot. I think it takes everyone back to, the fun aspect of being a curious kid and finding out how things work, how things happen, what's the real story. And you do a great job of that.
War, I think, is fascinating, unfortunately, perhaps, because there are just good stories in it, because the stakes are so high, right? We're dealing with life and death, with the survival of both people and civilizations. And it also is the area where a lot of resources tend to be concentrated. One of the things that really interests me about the past is just learning about what were things like, these very practical aspects of, how did they do things in the Roman Empire? Even though we've been talking about some of my research, which is about military history, most of my research is actually on these practical aspects of life in ancient Rome. For example, I have a book called Daily Life in the Roman City, which takes you through what it was like to be just a typical Roman, what you would have seen, what the kind of hazards you would have faced in your life in the city, living in the city, what that was like. And that kind of thing really fascinates me.
Have you visited Pompeii?
Oh, yeah, many times. So I've been to Pompeii a lot. I've been to Herculaneum. And actually, my favorite surviving Roman city is one that not many people go to, but they should. It's Ostia, which is Rome's port city. And it's about half an hour outside of Rome. It was never built over. So it's as well preserved as Pompeii, but not because of a disaster, just because nothing ever got built there. It was in a swamp. No one goes there either. So you can just crawl all over it and look around the ruins. And it's as much fun as Pompeii, but there's no tourists and it's close to Rome. And the difference, though, is that Pompeii is a kind of a resort city. It's rich people. Whereas Ostia is a sort of gritty industrial city. It's a port city. So it had a lot of warehouses. It had a lot of apartment buildings. Whereas in Pompeii, you see a lot of private individual homes with fancy wall paintings. And to me, there's something fascinating about seeing that kind of gritty infrastructure details. Well, here's where the average guy worked. Here's the warehouse he worked in. Here's the corner bar he went to. Here's the little local bath that he took a bath in. That's a fun place to visit if you're in Italy or if you're in Rome.
Greg, thank you for taking some time today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.